Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you all how to add materials to an object as well as change the color of it, and we'll also discuss some of the different properties within these materials that'll affect things like translucence, specularity, eccentricity, etc. So you won't probably don't know exactly what I mean yet, but once you go ahead and see when we start playing around with some of these properties within the materials, you'll start to get a really good understanding of what they do, what they mean, and how they work. So the first thing I would like to go ahead and do is make sure you open up your sword model, right? And from there, we'll just go ahead and just get started. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to select my object. I'm going to tap F just to center it inside the keyboard, or inside of the viewport, excuse me. And over here you have two little arrow keys. So this is all your properties within the attribute editor. If you'd like, you can just turn it on and off right here. Show hide attribute editor. There you go. So this will turn it on and off. And within here there should be by default like at least 3, 4, 5 different things, and you can use the arrows to toggle through. You can also press right click and you can quickly jump to each thing. In this case we need to go to the Lambert. Now if you click this, right click this, and there is a huge long drop down of stuff, right? Do an edit, delete all by type, and history, and that'll clear all that up because it actually will retain all that information inside there. So holding right click, or just tapping right click in this case, and you can just go to Lambert. Now I just wanted to show you that every single object by default that you build inside of Maya has a Lambert. So if I click off just to show you the sphere, the cube here, cylinder, etc. These all have the Lambert material. So every single thing by default that you create in Maya will start with the Lambert material. And in fact, these are all the shapes that we use to create this sword. The sphere being at the bottom, the cylinder for the handle, and the cube for both the hand guard as well as the blade. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. But now that we know where to find the material in here, let's go ahead and start assigning some materials. So I'm going to start by selecting faces, and I'm going to hold right click and go to face. And because we have those bevels, I'm going to tap 3 on my keyboard, and I'm going to start by selecting this one down here. And I'm going to hold shift and double click the corresponding one right next to it, and it will highlight all of that entire edge loop around the sword. Now I'm going to run a click and drag over the entire blade, and you're going to see that I've now got the entire sword selected, or at least the blade of the sword. Now from here I'm going to hold right click, and I'm going to go down and do assign new material. And from here I'm also going to, if you don't already notice, you see a whole bunch of different types of materials here. We're going to start by using a Blinn. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Blinn, and I want to start going through some of the properties on here that you can see. Now the first thing I want to do is actually, I'm going to name this under Blinn 1. I'm going to name this Blade Blinn Material. And that's just so I know what the object is, what type of material is associated with it, and the third thing why it says material is just so I know it's a material. If I have an object in my scene, I'll put like sword mesh or sword layer. So it distinguishes it if I'm looking through the outliner or something inside of Maya, so I know right away what I'm looking at. If this was named sword, and then the layer was named sword, and then the material was named sword, and I came to a part where I was trying to organize my file or find something in particular, and I saw 3 different swords, I wouldn't know which one's what. So it's always good to label. I like to add it at the end, so I have it blade as the object for this, Blinn as the type of material, and then the last one is material. So I know it's a material. Anyway, that's the naming system that I use for this. Going back to this, I have color here. I have a whole bunch of different type of properties in here. And we're only going to focus on common material attributes and specular shading. We're not going to dive into any of this other stuff down here because it just starts to get really, really complicated and it's just going to get confusing for you. So we're going to stick to the basics. The first thing I'd like to talk about is color. Now you can use this slider and adjust it to be dark or light or whatever, right? And you can also click on the color here and you'll get a little pop-up. It says color history. Here's a bunch of preset little default colors you can select from, and then also you have your color wheel over here. And I'm gonna just go with a lighter, I don't know, I'll go with like a lighter gray. And I have my little bar down here, so maybe I can go, I don't know, pretty light gray. Now anyway, now that I have that one color, I just changed it ever so slightly. I could change it to be any color I wanted. But I want to go ahead and show you something called specularity. Now you'll notice right off the bat that this sword has this specularity, whereas this blade, handle, and sphere down here do not. You'll notice that shine rotate as I rotate the camera around. And you'll see it on both sides. You'll see that shine on the blade. Now, the next thing I want to go into is called transparency. And this is cool for like windows or someone wearing glasses or something like that. And if I turn this transparency up, oh, I did this for the Lambert materials. I'm going to go to the Blinn material, and I'm going to turn this transparency up. I'm going to turn it all the way up. So it works on a grayscale from black to white, black being no transparency and white being 100% transparency. And one thing I'd like to show you with this one is that you'll actually still see the blade's specularity even though it is invisible. And I always find that to be pretty neat to mess around with, especially with windows and so on and so forth. So you'll actually be able to see through the window, but you'll also have some of those properties associated with it that'll still make it look like glass. Now I'm going to just jump to assigning a new color to a different part of this just to show you some of the different attributes of how these materials work. So I'm going to run a click and drag, and I'm just going to select all of these ones associated with the handle of the sword. And I'm going to hold right click and go to assign new material also. And this time I'm going to assign a Lambert to this one. I want to assign a new Lambert. So I'm going to call this handle Lambert material. And now I want to turn the transparency all the way up on this. I'm actually going to first change the color to a brown. You can mess around in the color wheel. I'm just going to select this one here. And now I would like to go to my handle Lambert material. And in here I'm going to turn my transparency all the way up. And I want to show you the difference between Blinn and Lambert. In Blinn, we have this preset sort of specularity that we can see, whereas on Lambert, we do not. There, you can see straight through this thing. It doesn't mean that the object's not there, because it is. And you can see it if I go into wireframe mode by tapping 4 on my keyboard. I'm going to go back to 5 for now. That the object is there, however, you don't get any of those reflective specular properties in the Lambert as you do with the Blinn. So I'm going to go back in here, and I'm going to go back into my Lambert handle material, and I'm just going to turn this back down all the way to 0, or all the way to black, so it has 0 transparency. And on the sword, I'm going to do the same thing under my Blinn material, because I just wanted to show you some of the different things it can do. Now, ambient color is associated with a bunch of materials, but I'll just show you what it does on the Blinn, so I don't have to show you the same thing over and over and over again. The ambient, you'll notice it starts to get really bright, and that's basically all it does. And it'll give it a really good glow if you add something, to like a glowy sort of, maybe like a lightsaber or something. You can get a lot of cool stuff in the rendering when we get into rendering. Incandescence sort of works the same. They kind of work hand in hand. And then I'll go ahead and bring that down. And then bump mapping. Now there's no slider on this. However, this is probably one of the most useful texture maps in this software. And we're going to get to this when we start to cover texturing. We'll assign a material and we'll assign a diffuse material or a color map, where we actually will be getting into adding textures to an object, but not only just a color sort of texture map. We're going to add the illusion of depth using something called bump mapping, and we're also going to get into specularity and how to control it more so, and we'll do that using Photoshop when we get into texturing. Now, that's really all I've got on the bump mapping feature for now. We do get into it more in detail in the coming weeks. So the next thing we have are diffuse, translucence, depth. We're not going to really mess around with any of these. However, I can go ahead and show you what they do. This sort of controls diffuse. A lot of people call a texture map, at least the color map of it, a diffuse texture map. So that's what it's sort of referring to there. Translucence, wouldn't worry too much about it. The depth of it and focus, I wouldn't worry about any of these because we're just going to cover the basics for now. Now, under specular shading, these can be really useful. Now, by default, it's set to eccentricity 0.3, specular roll-off 0.7. The specular color stays at about 50% on here. And then we have reflectivity and reflected color. So, just so you're aware, if you have reflectivity on, and even at 0.5 by default, it's going to look sort of like a mirror. It's going to have a really strong reflectivity. So be sure, I like to turn this down like all the time. You won't see it in the preview viewport here, but once rendered using at least the Arnold renderer, you will be able to see it. And we'll get into that in the coming weeks as well. We'll get into texturing and rendering and lighting and things like that. So the next thing I want to show you is just the difference between eccentricity and specular roll-off. So if you notice this little sample here, it'll be easiest to see in here probably, at least while I have the object highlighted. And I'm going to go ahead and just bring this up and down, and you'll see how that sort of becomes sort of like a pin light almost as I bring it down and up to be a much broader light covering this. So by default it's at 0.3. I'll leave it at 0.3 for now. And then the specular roll-off, you'll see it basically just plays it almost as like a softer, it gives it that softer edge or harder edge as it rolls off. And then the specular color is actually later, just as we would be doing with the bump mapping, where we assign an actual material to it. In the bump mapping would be to control the illusion of depth on geometry that's not really existing on the mesh, which is really cool. But that'll come later. And then the specular color is something we'll get into where we assign a material to that, and then using basically grayscale from black to white, how much reflectivity will show up on one point to another, and we can really get into controlling how light hits this object and how it sort of reflects in certain areas and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to cover that really quickly. Other than that, and then the reflected color, you could change the color, but I'm just going to leave it as black for now because we don't want to go ahead and mess with any of that. So that's pretty much all the properties I want to show you. The main ones being when we get into it. These can be useful, the transparency, ambiency, but the ones that we're really going to get into are the color, the bump mapping, and the specular, and that's going to come in the next few weeks. So after that, I just want to go ahead and assign get a little bit more practice in here, and assign all of these a material. We're going to assign this one, and I'm just holding Shift and double clicking, and now I'm going to run a quick click and drag and make sure I've got it all, which I think I do. So I'm going to hold right click and assign new material, and instead of adding a Blinn like I did last time, I'm going to add a Phong. So in the Phong, this has a lot of the same stuff as the Blinn, so I'm not going to cover all of it. In fact, I'll just cover like the differences, but they're really similar, and if you mess around with them enough, they can really get extremely similar results. However, they are different. And the most obvious one is this cosine power. And if you notice up here, it sort of controls the pin light on that Phong. It's a little bit more fine, but that's just kind of what it does. And all the rest work exactly the same. So I'm going to leave that as a Phong, and I'm going to change the color of this to be I don't know, like a darker gray, I guess, or Phong 1. I also want to name it, so I'm going to name this sphere. Ooh, sphere handle Phong material. And I'm going to change the color to be something different, to just make it a brighter red. Let's just make it this red. Alright. Just for fun. And now that I've got that done, I'm going to add a material to my final part here, which is on the handguard, is what I'm calling it. And I'm going to have to be very careful when selecting faces on this. I could run a symmetry and select a lot of the same faces on both sides, but it didn't seem to work, so we'll turn symmetry off. And I'm going to just start by double clicking a lot of these that I know are going to select easily and not into other parts of the mesh. And I'm just holding shift while I'm double clicking sort of away to get all the faces that I need. Okay. I think I've selected every face that I need, so I'm going to assign one more material because part of the lab we're going to have 4 different materials on here, and this time I want it to be, I'm going to hold right click and go to assign new material. I want it to be an Arnold shader, so under Arnold shader, and I'm going to select AI standard surface. AI standard surface, and here I'm going to rename it hand guard Arnold material. And from here, I have a bunch of different stuff. A lot of this can get into something called PBR texturing, basically, and it stands for physical based rendering. PBR. I'm just gonna double check that really quickly. PBR texture mission. Just to make sure I've got the proper physically based rendering. So that's the name of it. Now, PBR texturing is just a really, really advanced way to texture an object. If you've ever heard of a software, there's 2 major softwares out there that do really great PBR texturing. One being Quixel, Quixel Suite. I think it's Quixel Suite 2.0. That's a software that does PBR texturing, and it is a Photoshop plugin, so it's kind of cool in that respect. However, there's another one called Substance Painter, and Substance Painter is really becoming the standard for PBR texturing now. It's pretty much what you see on everything, and it's really becoming a common thing because our machines and our gaming systems and our computers and our phones and our tablets, they're all capable of rendering these things now with these high advanced textures when previously they weren't able to. So it's really become sort of this common ground. So in the future, we're going to get back into standard surface, Arnold, when we get into rendering. However, a lot of this stuff like metalness and diffuse roughness and all this other stuff, subsurface and all of that information is sort of going to get too technical. So I'm going to keep it simple. When we get into the AI standard surface, right now I just want to change the color of it. And I'm going to change this one to a dark gray. And that's it. And then I'm just going to quickly show you in here that the only ones we would worry about are color under specular, because we would use that to change the specular map on. The base color being our diffuse texture, or color map texture. And then we would go into also geometry, and this is where we would add our bump map. The rest of it we don't need to worry about. It's just too much information to cover, and we don't even get into that advanced of texturing, but we do get pretty advanced as far as we're gonna do some photo projection texturing and things like that. But that's in a few weeks from now. However, anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up on the direction we're going with the texturing. It's really neat, and it really does become like a lot of fun to do. So anyway, that's all I have for you. I hope I covered everything in here to help you understand this extremely well. And just make sure that you change all of the materials and label them. So you'll have you can have at least one Lambert, one Blinn, one Phong, and one Arnold material AI standard surface. I also want you to change the color of all of them. I didn't really change the color of the blade, I guess, by where is it? Blade, Blinn material. Yeah, maybe I did make it a little bit brighter. So there we go. So there's our sword now, and we've just gone ahead and added some new sort of colors to it and materials. So anyway, that's all I've got for you in this lab. If you do have any questions, be sure to shoot me a message, and we're going to get into far more detail into materials, texturing, lighting, and rendering in the coming weeks. So anyway, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next one, and yeah, take care.